Okay, good afternoon to all of you. I welcome you to the following session, which is related to climate change and agriculture and olive oil cultivation. And okay. Most of us have already been said. Okay. So, what's the contribution of the olive oil cultivation in mitigating the CO2 equivalent emission? How we can reach the full potential for mitigating the climate change? To what extent olive oil cultivation can contribute to the CO2 equivalent emission reduction commitment of the Jaén province, the Andalusia, and the producing countries? How we can increase the level of adaptation of the olive oil cultivation to the most likely scenario of climate change. Obviously, I do not pretend that all this, I do not pretend we will reach an answer to all these questions, but what I do hope is that we can share our thoughts or ideas on this issue, and who knows, maybe we can open new research line, new collaboration, in order to have these answers in the short to medium term. The agenda for this session is as follows. First of all, Pete Smith, who I will introduce properly shortly, will give a 30-35 minutes talk on greenhouse gas emission due to agriculture and the agri-food system, with a special reference to the olive oil cultivation. And we will have the opportunity to interact with him. We have time for several comments or questions. Afterwards, Marianne Bellot from the Department of Agronomy of the University of Córdoba will give about 15 minutes talk on her results in a set of outstanding and unique experiments. I'm not going to give you more cue for now on. And afterwards, we will open a round table, which will be chaired by Javier Fernández Almador from the UC Davis Olive Center in the United States, in which Mounir from Tunisia, Giorgio from Greece, and Giora Ben Ari will share their knowledge, their thinkings, their thought on this issue, and we will have the opportunity to have some feedback with them. And finally, I encourage you to stay at the end of this session. Finally, Jaime Lillo from the International Olive Council will share a key presentation of some European projects in which the University of Jaén is coordinator or participate in the research teams, projects regarding bioeconomy, biodiversity, ecosystem services, and climate change. So, without any further delay, let me introduce Pete Smith. I'm not quite sure if he's listening to us. Yes? Okay. Well, Pete Smith is professor in soils and global change at the Institute of Biological and Environmental Science at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and he is the director of the Scottish Climate Change Centre of Expertise. He is an authority in the topics of climate change mitigation and adaptation in agroecosystem, forest system, and agri-food system. He is the author and co-author of several hundreds of articles in high-ranked journals, and he has been actively involved. As a matter of fact, he is author of many of the IPCC reports in the near past, that I'm almost sure you have had the opportunity to read. He also is a fellow of the Royal Society of Royal Society of Biology, Institute of Soil Scientists, Royal Society of Edinburgh, Indian National Science Academy, European Science Academy, Royal Society of London, among others. And for me, and I'm sure that for the audience, it's a great pleasure, Pete Smith, that you can share a little bit of your knowledge or know-how on the global greenhouse gases emission from the agriculture and agri-food system and the potential for mitigation. So without any further delay, you have the words. Pete Smith, you can start whenever you like.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I hope you all enjoyed your lunch and the testing session and tasting session, and I hope you got a chance to look at the posters. So this afternoon I'm going to be talking about climate change mitigation potential in agriculture with a particular reference to olive groves. So first off, I'll talk about greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and the food system and the potential for mitigation at a global level before zooming in on olives specifically. So the first thing to note is that agriculture, forestry and other land use is responsible for direct emissions of around about a quarter of all human greenhouse gas emissions. So people frequently underestimate the contribution of agriculture and forestry to emissions. People tend to think it's energy and transport and industry, but actually a quarter come from agriculture, forestry and other land use, and that's just direct emissions. When we also account for the whole food system, so that's taken into account also things like transport, refrigeration, packaging and retail and other emissions from the food system. The food system is responsible for a third of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a third of all greenhouse gas emissions that we produce on the planet are associated with the production of the food that we eat. The food system is very complex, of course. Firstly, we have land use change, which occurs when we clear natural land for agriculture. There's less of that going on in Europe now because we've had our agriculture established for many centuries. But in many areas of the developing world, land use change for agriculture is still taking place. And then we have crop production, the emissions associated with producing the crops. So that's emissions from tilling the soil and emissions from agrochemicals that we add to the soil, particularly fertilizers, which are responsible for nitrous oxide emissions. We have emissions from livestock and agriculture. I'm not going to say much about that today because it's not really relevant to olive production. But then we also have emissions from processing, packaging, retail, losses and transport. And a brief schematic of all of the food system emissions are shown here, and this is a diagram from Pora and Nemecek, which they published in 2018, which looked at life cycle emissions from over 36,000 different life cycle assessments of food products, which enabled them to assess the contribution that different foods have to greenhouse gas emissions. Another paper that was published recently, this year in fact, was by Cripper et al. And this looked at food systems, and that was the one to establish that food systems are responsible for a third of our greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see, the industrialized countries, the emissions from the food system have actually fallen slightly by about 6% since 1990. But emissions in developing countries have greatly increased by over 100%, in fact, since 1990 to 2015, giving us overall increases in emissions in our total emissions from food production all over the world. And Cripper et al. Were able to produce this really nice Sankey diagram, which looked at all the different greenhouse gases that are produced by the food system. So over here on the left of the diagram, we've got methane, we've got carbon dioxide, we've got nitrous oxide, and then we've got the F gases. And it broke it down into the sectors where they occur. the stages of production, whether it's to do with land use change, production or transport or consumption, for example, and then the categories from which the primary emissions take place over here on the right. So it's a really nice way of tracking through all the processes in the food system and their contribution to the total greenhouse gas emissions, and which greenhouse gas emissions are emitted at the end. What's particularly interesting, I think, is that production and land use change account for about 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So the life cycle emissions, those to do with transport, processing, packaging, consumption, retail, and end-of-life disposal, only account for about 30%. So it's frequently overestimated the contribution of all these different supply chain impacts on the total greenhouse gas emission from food production, where in fact it's the production of our foods, the way that they're grown in the field, and the land use change. So that's where we've cleared land for agriculture, or we've displaced land for agriculture. They contribute 70% of all emissions. So for the remainder of the talk, I'll concentrate mostly on the emissions from land use change and from the production of food. But I will talk a little bit about demand side measures for mitigation. So these are the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and forestry over recent decades. So this was from the fifth assessment report, which we published in 2014, and it showed that it was the only sector in which net emissions had fallen in the decade 2000 to 2009. In all other sectors, transport, industry, business, industry, and such like, the emissions had increased, but that actually fallen in agriculture and forestry, predominantly due to a decline in the land use change that was due to clearing land for agriculture. Now these have started to go up again recently as Brazil has started net deforestation again. It was doing better in the decade up to 2000 to 2009, and these have started to increase again recently. But this gives you some idea of the contribution, land use change, drainage of peatlands, enteric fermentation from cattle, big sources. But then there are other sources from rice cultivation, manure management, synthetic fertilizers, manure applied to soils and on pastures. And then we've got things like crop residues and residue and savanna burning, smaller terms. So we have significant potential to reduce each of these emissions by mitigation measures in each one of these practices. So that these are supply side measures. These are things that we can do with the way that we do agriculture to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But there's also demand side mitigation potential, which I'll just mention briefly because it's not so relevant to olive production. This was another figure that from the fifth assessment report, and this is just showing the relative contribution of different food products on a kilogram per kilogram mass basis of the commodity. So this is how many kilograms per kilogram of, in this case, ruminant meat, cattle meat, that are produced. And you can see that there are some food types which are far more greenhouse gas intensive than others. So meat production, for example, is by far the most intensive production system in terms of greenhouse gases per kilogram of product. And that's why you hear so much in the press about the need for consuming less meat and dairy to reduce our individual climate footprint. But the other thing that you'll notice from this graph is that emissions have fallen over the decades. So between 1960 and 2010, for every single product, the emissions per unit of product have fallen. So that is just reflecting really that we're doing agriculture more effectively, more efficiently than we were in the 1960s. So we're getting less greenhouse gas emissions per unit of production. So our production has increased, our yields have increased, but the rate of increase of inputs and greenhouse gas emissions from the system haven't increased at the same rate. So we've got a declining greenhouse gas emissions per unit of production. So what can we do about, what can we do to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture? This is an estimate of the total global mitigation potential. So shown in green is the cropland management potential, rice management potential in dark green, and you can see that the areas growing most rice, such as Asia, have the largest potential here. It doesn't feature in many of the other regions. We have grazing land management has a significant potential, and the restoration of cultivated organic soils and degraded lands also has quite a significant potential. There's further potential in the livestock and manure management sectors, and also shown here in dark blue is the total cumulative potential for forestry. And this just shows the distribution around the world, what can be done, OECD countries, the economies in transition, Latin America, Middle East and Africa, and Asia. So there's a significant potential, but the portfolio of mitigation potentials differs a bit between regions, depending upon what is being produced most and what is being the stage of development in terms of use of land for agriculture. So this slide, also from the fifth assessment report, just shows the mitigation potential that's available at different carbon prices. So let's just focus on this up to $100 per ton of CO2 equivalents. And what's shown here in the yellow bars is the total mitigation potential from agriculture from all of those measures that I mentioned in all regions. And what you can see here is that the total mitigation potential is around about 4 or 5 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year. But over here on the left, on the right, are the demand side measures, which have a larger mitigation potential than all of the supply side measures put together. So these are things like dietary change and waste reduction. So by reducing waste by 50%, and by a transition to more in the over-consuming countries like ours in Europe and in North America and in some parts of South America, we over-consume livestock products and dairy to a large degree. So we could reduce our consumption of those products, which would greatly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So this is just to say that there are also demand side measures that need to be considered alongside these more technical supply side measures, which are to do with changing our practices in the field. Right, so that's the global picture. In terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction, we can change the way that we do our cropping, we can change the way that we fertilize, we can change the way we manage our soils. So let's have a little look now in a bit more detail at olive production specifically. And I'm going to use a few papers to which I contributed, collaborative papers, mainly with authors from Spain, in fact, working on these issues, who've spent time over in my lab working on modeling greenhouse gas emissions and soil processes in olive production. But the real experts here are the Spanish co-authors, the Spanish lead authors on these papers, but I'm going to report them because some of this work was done in my lab. The first one is from Granada, a collaboration with the University of Granada, which looked at soil organic matter and soil organic matter turnover in olive groves. So this was with Olivia Nieto and colleagues from Granada. And this was a nice paper that we managed to publish where we used the Rothamsted carbon model to look at turnover in soil organic matter and carbon increases that could be managed through different products. And what we found here is we were using Rothsea to simulate changes in two soils, chromic calcisols and calcic vertisols, so two different soil types. We had two different types of tillage. We had conventional tillage, and we had with and without mulching. And we were mulching with shredded olive pruning debris and with residues from olive fruit cleaning. So that's PD for pruning debris and CR from cleaning residues. And then we used the Rothsea model to simulate what would happen with soil carbon change out into the future. So if we had 50 years, the same practice, how might we expect the soil carbon sequestration to change over time? What we found actually that the soil carbon sequestration rates of between about 0.5 and 0.6 for these two different soils, respectively, from mulching with these different practices. So compared to current practice, where there's no mulching of materials returned to the soil, we found that mulching with olive pruning debris and residues from the olive fruit cleaning could significantly, if we reapplied them back to the soil, we could greatly increase the soil carbon content by about 0.5 to 0.6 tons of carbon per hectare every year, and that adds up to quite a significant increase in soil carbon over time. So this was already an indication that maybe we could look at innovative land management practices, integrated management practices within olive farms, within olive groves, to increase the soil carbon sequestration. And when we're increasing the soil carbon sequestration, of course, we're locking up carbon away from the atmosphere, and we're reducing the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. The second one that I'd like to show you is looking at carbon saturation and the assessment of soil organic carbon fractions in rain-fed olive orchards under plant management cover, different plant cover management. And this was with Jose Luis Vicente, who is from the University of Jaén. So it was very great to have him visiting our lab for a little while, where he conducted this work and some others which I'll show you later. What we found here was that we used 10 olive oil orchards under different plant cover managements. So that's PC on these graphs for plant cover, and compared those with bare soils. So where the vegetation was cleared in between the olive groves, as was standard practice for much of the area. So these are comparable with the bare soil olive orchards, which is shown here, NPC, which stands for no plant cover management. We found, like with the mulching, we found that the soil carbon concentration in these plant cover orchards was an average about 2.8 and 2 times higher than in bare soils where we had no plant cover. So again, plant cover in these orchards was providing a significant increase in the soil organic matter in 2 depths, 0 to 5 and 5 to 15 centimeters. Just about every fraction of soil carbon that we measured was increased in terms of with the plant cover compared to without the plant cover. And we saw an increase in the overall total soil organic carbon. So with the plant cover, we had a higher carbon content than we had with no plant cover. So again, showing that there are best management practices in olives are to keep the soil covered, in this case with plant cover, but it could also be with mulches, and that could help to offset the greenhouse gas emissions from olive production by creating sinks in the soil. Jose Luis's other paper was looking at soil carbon sequestration rates, and this was based on a meta-analysis. So this was looking at all Mediterranean woody crops, of which olives were just some, included others like dates and other forms, other Mediterranean crops. And this was a meta-analysis of 144 data pairs, and we had organic amendments, plants cover, and a combination of the two, combined management practices. The highest carbon sequestration rate was 5.3 tons of carbon per hectare per year, and that was observed following the application of organic amendments to the soil in olive orchards. That's especially after olive mill pomace application, whereas the management that achieved the lowest sequestration rates was this one here, CC, which had a continuous cover, and it gave us about 1.1 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So a lower sequestration rate, but nevertheless still positive. in collaboration with Alicia Ledo, also from Spain, when she was working in Aberdeen, we looked at changes in soil organic carbon under perennial crops, and we found that there was an increase compared with annual crops. The perennial crops, either perennial grasses or palms or woody crops, were giving us higher carbon sequestration levels than those annual crops. So the annual crops, things like olives, are much better at carbon sequestration, especially with best management practices, compared to annual crops. So this gives us a possibility for increasing soil carbon sequestration in agriculture. And from this and another analysis, we were able to develop a new allometric model which could look at biomass accumulation and greenhouse gas emissions in perennial food and bioenergy crops. We developed this allometric model, which just includes these processes. So we have above ground and soil processes, and it included all of the living biomass, the leaves, the fruit, the stalk, the trunk, the branches, etc. Included the residues and included the residue management. So we were able to develop this model to work out the total greenhouse gas balance of olives and other crops. So this has proved very useful, and we're using it now to examine some of the greenhouse gas emissions from olives compared to other crops. The last thing that I'll leave you with is a more recent analysis. This was led by Eduardo Aguilera, which looked at greenhouse gas emissions from all Mediterranean agriculture, and looked at how many papers have been published relative to the greenhouse gas emissions from different crops. And it was a really interesting analysis because it showed that the amount of research effort, the amount of papers published, is very uneven. So if we look at the emissions and sinks, we can see that cereals have fairly high emissions. Olives are the next biggest. If we exclude grassland and all the animals, we know that the animals produce large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions from enteric methane production and from manure management. But if we just look at crops, olives are just behind cereals. But we can then compare this to the greenhouse gas emissions, the soil carbon sequestration, the inputs, and the number of papers that have been published on these topics. So cereals are by far the most well studied, and they have maybe the largest emissions. Olives are actually quite well studied. And because they're the second amount of emissions, it's showing that we have quite a lot of knowledge about olives. We compare that to the amount of emissions that we get from animal agriculture, and there are very few papers that exist in these areas. So it shows a big gap in our research on reducing emissions from animal agriculture. But olives are quite well studied. And of only cereals and vegetables have received more attention of the Mediterranean crops than olives. But research has mainly been on N2O, as shown here, and some work on soil organic carbon change under olives. So some of that work that I was talking about earlier on was important for filling that gap. So in conclusion, the main greenhouse gas emissions from olive production come from nitrous oxide emissions from any N fertilizer that's used. I know that olive production is quite often organic. When it is organic, there tend to be less N2O emissions, but if any N fertilizer used at all, that can lead to large nitrous oxide emissions. And there are carbon dioxide losses from the soil organic matter and from soil erosion. So the main potential for greenhouse gas mitigation in olive production is through the following measures: reducing the mineral N fertilizer rates or shifting to organic fertilizers, using nitrification inhibitors or urease inhibitors to reduce nitrous oxide emission from N fertilization, if there's any being used. And lastly, by increasing soil carbon stocks through reducing tillage intensity where the area is disturbed for weed control between the olive tree rows, using cover crops to cover the ground, using mulches to cover the ground, so basically keeping the ground covered, reducing tillage intensity, and adding organic amendments which both increase the soil carbon content and also serve to fertilize the olives. So I would say in conclusion, olive production is actually, compared to many other crops, quite sustainable, but through the above improved management practices, I think it could be made even more so through these innovative soil management techniques especially, but also potentially through use of urease, nitrification inhibitors, and changing fertilization practice. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll leave it there and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Pete. I do have some questions for you. And first of all, I don't know if there is a microphone. Just a second. Maybe you can introduce yourself when the microphone.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dr. Smith, for your great presentation. My name is Jaime Lillo from the International Olive Council. I hope you can hear me right.
Yes, I can hear you, Jaime. Go ahead.
Excellent. So, yeah, I understand the part of the missions, but my question is regarding the mitigation. No? When we look at the olive orchard, at the olive production system, it's a permanent crop, and we have already evidence that is the capacity of sequestration is particularly for those olive trees which has been for hundreds of years in places with very lower rain, when there is not competition with, I don't know, with rainforest or other kind of forest. We tend to think that they are already a Mediterranean forest in many areas, and we have a difficulty for the recognition of the sequestration capacity, because I see that all the focus in agriculture, of course, is focusing on the emissions and how much is contributing to the emissions, but certain particular crops like the olive orchards, they are part of the solution, particularly if you compare with alternative oils or alternative products. And this is my question. We have a very difficult to make this concept go through the scientific community involved in the climate change reports and so on, with the legislations, and finally even to the consumers. When we try to explain and we made the calculation of the CO2 balance when producing olive oil, that the estimations are that it is a positive balance. So actually by taking the option of choosing olive oil is a better climate change option to be used, not only for the health and other issues. But we have a lot of difficulties for this recognition and to pass this message. I wonder if you have some recommendations or what your thoughts, how can we improve this message that the olive oil and the olive orchards are somehow already part of the solution. Of course, yes, there is room for improvement, as you already say, but the principle of being part of the solution more than part of the problem.
Yeah, sure. Well, firstly, I'd say that there's a difference between carbon sequestration and carbon storage. Now, you're right in what you say about olive groves being a very big carbon store, because they're at maturity and they do store a lot of carbon. So that's quite right. But that's a different thing from carbon sequestration. Carbon sequestration is defined as the net annual removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by the production system. Now, if the olive groves have been there for many hundreds of years or even many decades, they're likely to not be taking CO2 down from the atmosphere because the carbon that's going in will equal the carbon that's going out from respiration. So when they're at equilibrium, by definition, there is no net carbon sequestration. So I think partly the difficulty is getting across the point that whilst there is no net carbon sequestration in olive groves, they do represent a large carbon stock, which if they were destroyed, all of that CO2 would go up into the atmosphere. So that's the big distinction that needs to be made. We need to make the distinction between carbon sequestration, which is the net annual removal, and carbon storage, which is the amount of carbon that's stored in the biomass and the soils. One way to increase the carbon sequestration is through those measures that I talked about earlier. Instead of keeping the area between the olive trees, between the rows of olive trees bare, if we can manage that by mulching it and by using cover crops or by mowing the grass in between them, rather than mechanically weeding them, we can increase the amount of carbon that's stored in the soils. I think the trees are more or less at equilibrium. They're very old, so there's no net removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. But there could be a net removal through improved soil management, and then you can really claim a carbon sequestration benefit, as well as the additional carbon storage benefit that we all know about.
Thank you. Any further question? Pete, I do have a question for you, or at least I would like you could share your opinion about my question. If we demonstrate that by applying a combination of, let's say, sustainable management practices, as you already mentioned, if we demonstrate that we are able to keep carbon, organic carbon, not only in the soil, but also in the permanent structure of the trees, if we demonstrate so, do you think it will be viable in the near future that the European, somehow the farmer can get money because they are putting CO2 into atmosphere? Because as far as I am concerned, this issue has been on the table in Europe, but I'm not sure why is the reason why an industry can get the economic benefits of reducing the CO2 equivalent emission, but not the farmers. What's your opinion about that?
Yes. Well, I think the thing that you can get paid for a carbon credit for carbon that is removed from the atmosphere. So again, you won't get paid for storing carbon. So that carbon that doesn't change, that's already in the trees, that would be regarded as not additional. So that's going to be there anyway. The additionality comes from improving the management practices where you are taking a net removal of CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it in the soil. So that you should be able to get a carbon credit for. The reason it's not seen so much is because it's very difficult to demonstrate a change in soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is a very large stock, and the changes in soil organic matter are very small and they take a long time to occur. So it's partly a difficulty in monitoring, reporting and verification of that soil carbon change. And that's the main barrier, I think, at the moment to accessing the voluntary carbon markets. But I think there is a voluntary carbon, there is potential for accessing the voluntary carbon markets if you can demonstrate that you're improving the practices, because we've now got very good evidence that the best management practices can increase the soil carbon at least. So you should be able to claim those carbon credits on the voluntary carbon market.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I do agree with you, because I'm doing carbon balance in olive grove, and in an olive grove with cover crops and tree pruning apply on top of the soil. We apply composted olive meal pomace, and we only get an annual increase of about 100 kilograms, 200 kilograms of soil organic carbon after discounting all the emission due to the decomposition of this organic matter. And and agree to you that we only can have a measurement each 10 years or 20 years in order to demonstrate that a significant change has been measured. I don't know if the audience has got any further question to Pete Smith. Yes, there is another question there.
Thank you. My name is Simon Poole, and thank you for an excellent presentation. This is not so much a question as a comment, really, for Jaime, about whether or not the 2016 IOC declaration on the carbon sinking of olive oil, which many of us in communication quote, whether more of the methodology could be available on the IOC website about how the statement that each litre of a well-maintained olive grove can sink 10 kilograms of carbon. I would really like to see more of that methodology available, because I don't tend to quote that statistic now because I can't see the raw data behind that, and I don't really know the evidence that was used, and I'd be really welcome more access to that on the website.
Thank you very much. I do agree that there is some kind of disconnection between the methodology set up by the researcher and let's say the politician and the companies. There are many companies that are doing CO2 footprints, and me as a scientific, I do have many, how I can tell you, complaints against the methodology they are using this company. Unfortunately, there is no an harmonization of the methodology to estimate not only carbon balance but also carbon footprint. At the end of the day, I don't know if the company who has done this carbon footprint has taken into account this, or which kind of a coefficient has been used, especially when I am fully aware of the great variety in the value of the various coefficient. I'm sorry, Pete, for monopolizing this. So we are a little bit rush of time. So if there are not any very urgent question, I don't see any further questions. So, Pete, thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure to have you here. I know that you are a quite busy man, so the audience is quite grateful to share your knowledge. Okay, thank you very much.
Have a great meeting. Thank you.